The true believers say Donald Trump uses the geopolitical landscape like a massive canvas on which the art of the deal is a constantly evolving masterpiece. To others, his announcement to withdraw 5,000 troops from Germany looks less cerebral and more like an act of hot-blooded revenge. Revenge on the German Chancellor Friedrich Merz, bold enough or silly enough to say the US has no strategy in Iran, that the US is being humiliated. Now, whether the partial troop withdrawal represents a tactical shift or diplomatic revenge, the ramifications are real and begs serious questions like, is this the beginning of the end for massive installations like Ramstein, or just tit for tat at the top levels of government? Clifford Coonan, you've been watching geopolitics for a long, long time. Just your opening salvo here.
Yeah. Well, I think it's a bit of a mixture of both, isn't it? Like so many Trump policies, there's sort of, you can see some method. In other ways, you see very much a lack of method. I think it's certainly a significant move. How much of it we weren't really expecting is also open for debate. But yeah, this is a big story.
Right, so let's get into it. Michaela Kufner is DW's chief political editor, one of the cornerstones of our political coverage, which includes the Berlin Briefing. It's a must-watch weekly feature on the DW newsfeed in times like these. At moments like these, Michaela, I want to know if you think this is a direct act of political revenge for Merz's comments about Iran's humiliation, and part B, does it matter whether it's revenge or not at this point?
It does, and clearly the communication we've seen from Donald Trump is deliberate in wanting to portray it as, you call it revenge, but as a direct reaction to what he sees as clearly an inappropriate comment by the German Chancellor, who's been on the record several times before saying he didn't see any strategy in Iran. But the whole sentence about the humiliation, that is very personal. That seems to be a question of personal honor, particularly as the US president is increasingly under fire back home, with about 2/3 of Americans believing in recent polling that this war was a mistake in the first place. Donald Trump was very vocal from day one in that Oval Office meeting with Friedrich Merz as well, when I personally asked what his expectations are towards partners, European partners over Iran. He showed himself very disappointed in partners like Spain and Italy, which then also closed airspace. Britain as well, who's no longer part of the European Union, and there already he announced troop withdrawals. So it clearly seems to be a mixture of both. What we're seeing is not structural cuts. We are seeing a cut in a brigade combat team, which was deployed by the Biden government after the attack by Russia on Ukraine. Romania has already seen similar forces pulled back by the Americans. But what will cut really deeply is that the communication also is that the United States doesn't want to clearly keep to the Biden commitment of stationing medium to long range weapons. Certainly the troops required for that will now no longer be deployed. And this really is a huge issue for the Germans in particular, but also for European defense. What we're hearing here is that it's not such a huge surprise, that the Europeans had been bracing for it, and that this does not endanger the NATO ability to act. Then you would say that, but clearly this is more than just a political drama that we saw last week unfolding.
Yeah, I listened intently to Max, yourself and Julia in the Berlin Briefing. You were speaking before we got this reaction or decision from Trump. You remarked at the time you feared or wondered whether this might evolve into the beginning of a feud between Merz and Trump. Are we there yet?
Well, we're actually at a very difficult low point. It was the pride of German Chancellor Friedrich Merz, who's coming up to his first year of a 4-year term, that he instantly managed to hit it off with the US president, who's so important, and that his CEO style of communication seemed to work, and that they speak on the phone every couple of weeks. The open question to me now is, when will we see them speaking the next time? Clearly, Donald Trump has decided facts is the language of choice at this moment in time. And if that relationship, that personal relationship, deteriorates beyond this point where we don't see direct communications, this is a huge issue of concern, both for Germany, but also for Europe, because one thing is for sure, the entire world economy is trapped in the fallout of the Iran war. And if now there is even less of an impact in terms of being able to speak to the US president, whom the German Chancellor told quite clearly, I wasn't consulted and I would have advised against. That's what he said at his last meeting in the Oval Office with Donald Trump. Then this will mean that the Europeans have even less of a say in dynamics they cannot control. And we're already seeing this to a large degree over Ukraine as well.
Clifford, just one for you before we go on. I want to come back to you, Michaela, and talk about the relationship specifically. In terms of the details of what we know about this withdrawal, how much of a problem is it strategically and what effect does it have immediately?
Right, well, there's excuse me, there's up to 39,000 US soldiers currently in Germany, with around 13,000 Air Force personnel, and they're spread across 20 different sites, mostly in the south and southwest of the country. And we'll go into more detail of that later. But while it's significant, it still leaves about 31 to 35,000 troops here. So there's still a lot of US troops in the country. And the key facilities, Ramstein airbase and Landstuhl Regional Medical Center, are not expected to be affected.
Right.
And so they'll maintain their roles. But it is still a significant number.
Okay. On the way back to you, Michaela, I want to get the words of the German Defence Minister, Boris Pistorius, who has responded to the planned US troop withdrawal. We're going to take a look at part of his statement in a moment. I'll read it out. The presence of American troops in Europe and in Germany in particular is both in our interest and that of the United States. We work closely with the Americans in Ramstein, Grafenwohr, Frankfurt and elsewhere for peace and security in Europe, for Ukraine and collective deterrence. But for the US, this is combined with other military tasks, including serving their geopolitical interests in Africa and the Middle East. It was entirely foreseeable, so says Boris Pistorius, that US troops would be withdrawn from Germany. Talking to your point, Michaela, we're talking about 5,000 out of a total of around 40 currently stationed in Germany. It's clear that Europe must play a bigger role within NATO in order to remain transatlantic. In other words, as Europeans, we have to take more responsibility for our own security. Clifford, you first, and then on the way back to Michaela. So how much of a surprise?
I think this was foreseeable, as Pistorius said. You know, that if you look at the places where they're implementing these cuts, one of them is this army brigade, which is believed to be the 2nd Cavalry Brigade Regiment, which is based in Vilseck in Bavaria. That's already been kind of identified for redeployment, and this is sort of there as protection against Russia, as potential threat of Russia. Right. So it has the optics are quite significant, but they'll probably be brought. This is all speculation and at the moment, of course, because the Pentagon haven't confirmed it. But they'll probably go back to the US and then be redeployed somewhere near the Black Sea, probably. Right.
I'm going to get to some comments coming in on TikTok and YouTube as quick as I can. Michaela, I want to go back to the relationship, I guess, though, as we try and map a way forward. I want to reminisce, I guess. You were in the Oval Office, as my memory serves, with both these men. My memory has you interviewing the German Chancellor, almost in the afterglow of how it went for Merz personally and for Germany in that meeting. Fast forward to this week, my first reaction when I read the words were, I thought it was going so well. Is that the case, that you thought it was also going so well, and how did we get here so fast?
Well, clearly we need to separate between the first meeting in the Oval Office, which launched kind of this instant romance, would be probably taking it too far, but this instant understanding of essentially what are two businessmen. Donald Trump himself having been a lifelong businessman, Friedrich Merz once having left politics to launch into big business, into private equity, to then return to become German Chancellor. They literally spoke the same language. That was a huge success, and that's what this relationship has been built on. Now, fast forward more than 6 months, there was the second meeting earlier this year where it already got got tricky. This was when there was this criticism by Donald Trump. He felt abandoned clearly by European allies, and Friedrich Merz was already putting some distance between himself and the Iran war, basically explaining that Germany would not be able to join, partially for constitutional reasons. This is a far cry from the previous government when we saw the invasion on Iraq, where the German government, including the Greens and the Social Democrats, said, "I'm sorry, I'm not convinced." Well, in a way, this is the modern day version of saying, we do not see a strategy in this, and we will only help you and help secure the Strait of Hormuz once the war is over. Now, every time I ask, what's the definition of the war actually being over? Nobody is willing to explain that to me in the German government, because it wouldn't be the first time that we see a US president declare victory in a war and then the fighting actually continues on the ground. Facts do speak for themselves. The first German minesweeper left port just a couple of days ago, heading into the region, clearly putting Germany in a position where it would be able to step up and actually demonstrate that it wants to be helpful. This, of course, relying fully on there being this alliance with other European countries, France and Britain, including them, and an actual mandate that would need the German Bundestag, the parliament, to vote for it. I mention this because this really is a German peculiarity. It's not like we see in the US, where a US president can just act alone and send out troops.
So if you are living outside of Germany, Michaela, and just joining the chat, so to speak, approval ratings are low for Merz, the economy is sluggish, big industry is worried, and now this. How is Friedrich Merz going right now?
Well, according to the polling, he's not going well at all. He already started lower than both of his predecessors, Olaf Scholz and Angela Merkel, in the polls, and then he hit a new floor, being down at 21% approval ratings. If you look at the entire government, it's down at 15%. So this really is a very bad record for a German government, and this has many different reasons, and it's being exacerbated by the Iran war, which will mean that the government will continue to have bad news for German consumers. The only modifying factor here is that bad news for German consumers is bad news for US consumers as well. Donald Trump was elected on a platform of ending wars. Now he started one. A majority of Americans is against this, and they are feeling the pain at the pump, and they're feeling it increasingly in the grocery stores. So this needs fixing. There we have consensus. The question is whether German and European diplomatic efforts to push for some kind of peaceful resolution can actually work together with the, let's put it this way, a very abrasive take that the US government keeps taking, particularly also publicly, towards the Iranian regime.
All right, back to you in a second, Michaela, as we try and sort of map a path forward from where we are now. Just in terms of business, Clifford, and the way Germany is seen, Michaela speaks to how frankly negative the picture is for German industry and the way they see the economy right now. How's the German economy perceived in the rest of the world, and how's it going on a global landscape?
Well, I think the German economy's got a lot of problems at the moment. It's dealing with a downturn in China, not a downturn in China, but it's dealing with increasing competition from China. Yeah. It's having to deal with tariffs by the Trump administration on its cars. It's under attack from a lot of different sides, from what were formerly allies, or at least strategic allies anyway. So it's not a good time for this to be happening, in terms of adding this sort of geopolitical aspect to what is also a very challenging economic environment.
Right. So within that context, I want to talk about the path forward and what this relationship and Merz's strategy or his positioning. Canadian PM Mark Carney won an election by suggesting that the entire nation get its elbows out, Michaela, and stand beside him as he took on Trump toe-to-toe, so to speak, and it proved to be very popular. Is there any chance Merz gets a popularity bounce by saying the quiet part out loud? Our commentators across platforms want it. I'll just give you a quick sample. Jonas Pereira on YouTube, if you're living outside of Germany, what Merz said about the war was probably his biggest accomplishment since he took office. Best thing I saw him say or do since that time. Style G9128, he literally just said the truth. Americans are absolutely humiliated by this conflict and his whole presidency. One more from Kees Hessels. Merz and others should speak out louder and more often. I applaud him. I know it's a small sample size, Michaela, but there were literally 2,000 comments below the Berlin briefing video that you posted and one we did yesterday, reflecting that sort of thought. I know politics is a very different arena, but is it worth asking what chance Merz pivots to a more muscular stance towards Trump and the United States at this moment?
Well, his problem is that he has to now bridge a huge gap between being right and getting things right. And the economy is already struggling with very long-term structural issues here in Germany. And on top of that, now comes the Iran war. And on top of that, we now see a US president clearly targeting Germany. It's very difficult to read it any other way when he suddenly increases tariffs on car manufacturers in the European Union, when those German car exports make up at least 2/3 of that, particularly in the higher price range. And as Clifford just mentioned, with car sales dropping drastically in China for German automakers. And that's where those profits came for in recent years. That will translate into job cuts pretty fast. We already saw Volkswagen saying it wants to reduce capacity here. That's what Friedrich Merz is up against. At the same time, he got criticism in the latest human rights report by Amnesty International, for instance. Human rights organizations are criticizing him for not being outspoken enough. And I just want to remind us that only a couple of weeks ago, when we saw that post by Donald Trump speaking about the erasure of an entire civilization, it was Friedrich Merz who said that he saw this as a rhetorical part of Trump's strategy towards Iran. Since then, he has he was asked whether he's disillusioned. He says, yes, that's what he said this past week. And he is clearly openly speaking about a lack of strategy. There's a very erratic president in the White House, and there are great dependencies. This is now the opportunity for the Europeans to muster their courage and stand up to the US, which is such a key market, though, but it's also an important market for the United States. So let's see how this plays out.
Clifford?
Yeah, I want to go back to something that Michaela mentioned earlier and maybe hear her view on this. I mean, the two areas that look like we're going to see the removal of this brigade, a striker brigade, as they call it, where a rapid deployment force that will possibly be sent back to the US. And then the other part has been the announcement, the speculation as it is now, because they haven't yet confirmed it, but it is reported that they will reverse a Biden administration decision to deploy a battalion with long-range conventional missiles to Germany later this year. What do you think the significance of that is? And will this make Germany less safe?
Not in the short term, but in the medium term. And that's really what the gap that Germany wanted and Europe wanted to bridge with this. With the Arrow 3 system expected out of Israel, also not a very stable region at this moment in time. In the pipeline, this was an attempt by Germany and Europe to bridge that defense capability gap. And that is widening actually by the day, because much more imminent is the concern that the US, having depleted its own high-range, top-range weapons significantly over the Iran war, will now be slow to deliver weapons already ordered and paid for by European allies, both for Ukraine, but also for those European stockpiles. And that is an imminent concern that certainly the German government and NATO will not volunteer to talk about, as goes the medium and longer range missiles. this was an issue that was always lingering quietly in the background, and that certainly Friedrich Merz's team was never volunteering, just hoping it would go through. Now the certainty is growing, but this was frankly also already the expectation that a Biden administration pledge to station these missiles here in Germany probably wouldn't happen. So that is becoming immediately more imminent and clearer, but this is not a shocking surprise, but it still doesn't make it better. It just increases the pressure on the Europeans, to put it bluntly, to get their act together. And that also means displaying more unity and being more down to earth about developing own capabilities. Ordering from the US, you cannot buy your way out of this defense gap anymore because the deliveries simply aren't reliable.
A question on YouTube asking, do we miss Angela Merkel already, Michaela? I don't perhaps want an answer to that so much as understanding how Friedrich Merz, how difficult the job gets. The more difficult it gets domestically here in Germany, how much more difficult is it for him to fight Trump as long as his approval rating goes down and the economy gets worse? How much more difficult does that make life for Merz?
His life is already very difficult. He just gave interviews saying that no chancellor had such a hard time before him. You can have a long debate about that. What I want to say about Angela Merkel being the reference point, she successfully managed to coin a brand of stability politics that Germans have always been, or in modern day, have been craving for. But that also at a cost. She was the first chancellor to openly speak about climate change being a very pressing issue, about digitization. She spoke openly about the need for reforms. The problem is that the administration after found that she simply didn't tackle a lot of these issues because they did make her unpopular. They carried too much political risk. And now this has landed on Friedrich Merz to pull through these reforms while at the same time having what is a very erratic global disorder. And yes, that is a very difficult path. At the same time, Friedrich Merz says he's taken on the challenge, and he says he is willing to use his coalition with the Social Democrats, that's those two parties at the center, to pull through reforms while weathering the storm of the Iran war. But we do not know where this is going to take us. Look, a 17-cent discount in fuel tax just came into effect here in Germany. We don't know whether that will even still play a role in the pricing that terribly much in a couple of weeks' time if this conflict continues. So a great amount of uncertainty.
Chief Political Editor Michaela Kufner, so great that we get to tap your experience, particularly today. A reminder again to everyone who feels that we are at a critical moment in US-German and US-European relations. The Berlin briefing does exactly what it says on the pack, and it does it weekly. If you haven't seen it, check it out. On the other hand, if you know, you know. Michaela, thanks so much. Really appreciate your time as always. All right, we'll move it along. I've seen the questions starting to flood in. I know there's a lot of support, and I read out a few for what Merz has done and the position that he took, but there's another one here. I'm 100% against the war in Iran, but Europe needs to stop expecting the US to do everything for them. There is very much that thread to what we're seeing in the messages flying through. As we sit here, what do you think the expectation is from NATO toward the US?
Well, I think in some ways, just like to go, this very much bears the hallmarks of the first Trump administration as well, doesn't it? When he was he really went out of his way to say that Europe needs to pay more. It needs to meet this 2% of GDP for defence spending goal. It's very much within that. Now, I know the timing of it now is probably as much to do with domestic US concerns as it is anything else. But it's very interesting how it taps right into Europe's greatest fear, which is Russian invasion. And it comes right as Europe is fighting a war, or as Ukraine is fighting a war with Russia.
In many ways,
European
fighting
backing.
between friends is so much more vicious than fighting between strangers, right?
Yeah, 'cause you know their weaknesses. You know their weaknesses.
And this has landed.
Yeah, right there. I mean, if you look at these, particularly as Michaela mentioned, the long-range missile capacity that Europe is currently building up, it doesn't come overnight. It takes a while. So this was a bridging solution. They've got a program called ELSA, which is the European Long-Range Strike Approach, which they're doing with the UK, Poland, Italy and Sweden. So they're building up this capacity, but it takes time. And then suddenly this long-range missile capacity is taken away and it leaves Europe feeling exposed. Right. So there's a lot of these issues. So NATO is going to be looking at that, and it's going to, again, to see how NATO reacts is, so far we've had some information from other correspondents saying it sounds very much like it's a holding pattern at the moment.
Yeah, I can bring up the NATO reaction if we want. It was a NATO alliance spokesperson that gave this response on X. Sorry for the lack of notice to our producers. We are working with the US to understand the details of their decision on force posture in Germany. This adjustment underscores the need for Europe to continue to invest more in defence and take on a greater share of the responsibility for our shared security, where we already seeing progress since allies agreed to invest 5% of GDP at the NATO summit in The Hague last year. We remain confident in our ability to provide for our deterrence and defence as this shift towards a stronger Europe in a stronger NATO continues. Just watching the Trump effect, amazing to cast your mind back not many years to what the NATO budgets were. His effect is unmistakable, whether or not you like, respect, love him or otherwise.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, back then, 2% he was laughed at in the European Parliament, right. and it was just 2%. And then suddenly NATO steps up and is talking about 5%, and it was really doing something. And like some of the things Trump does, you know, the style is appalling, but they do have an impact, and I think, you know, in some ways this is kind of in that mode, isn't it?
Yeah, and a couple from Mel Perkins here on TikTok. NATO, do us a favour, NATO. We don't have to bail you out again. That sentiment is very, very much there. We're of course talking, if you've just tuned in, that 5,000 troops will leave Germany. That's the headline number announced by Donald Trump. It seems, or it definitely comes a few days after Friedrich Merz criticised the US approach to Iran and whether or not they had a strategy, in saying that they were being humiliated. So 5,000 troops is the headline number. Just to revisit for those joining us later, do we know many of the details about what it is, who it is, what skill set, what equipment will leave, and how big a problem is that of the withdrawal of these US troops? Do we know much of the detail?
Well, we're dealing with speculation still, because the Pentagon hasn't confirmed this, but it's believed that one unit is the 2nd Cavalry Regiment. It's a combat brigade based in Vilseck in Bavaria. It's got 3,900 troops, and it's basically, they run on these Stryker 8-wheeled vehicles, and they're designed for rapid deployment, that within 96 hours they can be deployed anywhere in the world. And it's very much part of modern warfare thinking and strategy. This is seen, when you think about Ukraine, a lot of these Stryker vehicles are being deployed in Ukraine as we speak, actually, because they've been part of the equipment deals between the US and Ukraine. So that, again, is kind of worrying for the NATO forces who are here. I mean, they will probably be redeployed, probably in the Black Sea, where they've been redeployed before. They'll go back to the States for a bit and then be redeployed. So that's one element. And then the second one is this long-range conventional missiles unit, which was supposed to be deployed later this year. This was a Biden administration initiative, and so Trump reversing it is very much expected and probably would have happened anyway.
Yeah. Look, a load of comments, and we've got to a few of them, but not all of them. Apologies if we have skipped over. We're going to wrap it up here shortly. I just wonder what the next days bring now. As always, we don't know. We're talking about the speculation. We know Reuters are reporting what you have relayed to us and what comes next. Is there still enough wiggle room for this not to be so bad, or is it more important just the visuals of what we see? The chat is kicking off, and we've seen these comments for days since this first came up, and it is not one-way traffic. It's very much Frank on TikTok here, for example. Tell me something America needs but doesn't have And there's that attitude, well, perhaps we don't need you.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. These bases are so much part of German life. I mean,
Right.
for decades. You know, at one point there was 250,000 US troops in Germany. 250,000 troops. It's this astonishing number. And it's become so much part of the fabric of post-war German history. And now the numbers are being whittled away. And then we have this big step, which would be 5,000 at once. So it's really a large step. And it's a big issue for Germany to deal with.
Clifford, thanks so much, mate. Really appreciate it. Good to talk on a pretty significant day here in Germany, and perhaps for Europe. We await, as ever with Trump, as to what comes next and to what details we find out. But certainly quite a few of you have had your say along the way today. It was great to get your thoughts as we all digest a big moment in America's relationship with Germany and its other European NATO allies. This format is designed for you to take part, and that you have today in numbers. It's been fantastic. If you are watching on demand, the opportunity is still there for you to have your say. Please do. From Berlin for now, it's goodbye from Clifford and goodbye from me. Have a good day.